District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
Don't you love it when things are both easier and more affordable? Like when the rain washes your car for you. Or like when you save up to 10% by bundling your renters and auto insurance with USAA. Bundle with USAA and start saving. Get a quote today.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Happy May, everyone. I hope this month is off to a great start for you. There's a lot of news regarding reconciliation, public lands, National Park Service, the budget from the president, and we're going to break down all those topics. But today, for this week, I'm going to narrow it down to three things that I think are important to discuss. Namely, that there are going to be national wildlife refuges open to new hunting and fishing opportunities. That was something that got kind of lost in the news cycle. I'm going to dive a little bit into some of the proposals of President Trump's fiscal year 2026 budget, what I like, the one concerning item I have there. And then, because this is related to the National Park Service, I do have to touch upon the supposed reopening of Alcatraz and what that means from a cultural, historic site perspective, and if that is feasible or not, and if that detracts from visitation. So we'll crunch down these three stories today on the podcast. But before I dip into these stories, Substack has deemed my Outsider on the Inside newsletter number 50 rising Substack newsletters in their climate and environment category. That's pretty cool. I don't strive to make waves or do anything out of the ordinary, no clickbait stuff. I try to do original news reporting. What I can't do originally, I will often recycle my works from IWF, Town Hall, my podcast, and videos and documentaries that I do with CFACT. So it's kind of like a hub where you can see all my writings and works. You can listen to the podcast, as I mentioned there. And that's pretty cool that they have that. So I wanted to say thank you, Substack, for recognizing that. And if you don't subscribe, you can find the link to my Outsider on the Inside Substack in the show notes of the program here. I want to first touch on this opening of new hunting and fishing opportunities expansion. This was dated May 2nd. And understandably, a lot of people have been asking me, where are going to be these hunting and fishing opportunities open? Because it seems like the Trump administration is only interested in energy development, which is very important. Department of Interior's function is to oversee oil and gas leases, also mineral rights. But everyone forgets, and it's an extremely important facet of this agency when you examine the history, and I think this is an extremely important dynamic of it, the conservation bit, not just the energy development bit, but what actually happens with respect to conservation. And I don't think there's going to be a total despoiling of the environment because you have provisions like this. So what Secretary Burgum had announced last week is that there's going to be 42 new proposed hunting opportunities across 87,000 acres in the National Wildlife Refuge and National Fish Hatchery System. It would more than triple the number of opportunities and quintuple the number of stations opened or expanded compared to the previous administration, underscoring a strong commitment to outdoor recreation and conservation. Secretary Burgum is quoted as saying, quote, "Expanding recreational access to our public lands isn't just about tradition, it's about supporting rural economies and the American families who depend on them. By opening more areas to hunting and outdoor recreation, we're helping drive tourism, creating jobs, and generating revenue for local communities while promoting responsible stewardship of our natural resources." The service is proposing to open or expand opportunities for hunting and sport fishing at 16 National Wildlife Refuge System stations and 1 National Fish Hatchery station. These are located in Alabama, California, Idaho, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, Montana, North Carolina, Texas, and Washington. And the press release is quoted as saying, "The service is committing to ensuring that all hunting and fishing opportunities align with state fish and wildlife regulations. We'll continue to work closely with our state partners to maintain consistency in areas such as lead ammunition and fish tackle, and we will incorporate these considerations into future updates. I like that they're not caveating openings with lead tackle and bullet restriction. That was a totally misguided policy. Every Democrat administration seems to do this, even though the science yet has ruled out that a total ban does nothing to help the perceived species that they claim they want to help, and then you're displacing people from hunting and fishing with the death by 1,000 cuts measure. So I'm glad to see that, and we will be seeing more openings and announcements. I don't work for Department of Interior, but I just know from history, from Trump 1.0, you'll see more measures like this. We'll see, if not already, I think because of executive orders undid a lot of the machinations from the Biden admin, we probably already have seen that 60 plus million acres in Alaska reopened to caribou hunting. And you'll see a lot more openings, not conditioned on really arbitrary, stupid, to be honest, things like lead prohibitions, tackle prohibitions. And I think if you just simply focus on energy development, you can't, develop every single acre of federal land to that. And that's not going to happen. And I've also cautioned here on the show and publicly when I went on the Dana Lash program a few weeks ago that I think this proposal to put affordable housing on federal lands is not a smart idea either. I think maybe in small places it could work. It's being attempted in Las Vegas, but to bring those urban housing problems to rural areas where there's no supporting infrastructure, where people are residing to get away from the problems of urban outposts. If you can't fix that problem in urban areas, you think it's going to get better and improve in rural areas, stick to the bread and butter. If I was advising the Department of Interior, I hope that they continue to stick to the bread and butter of the agency, not deviate with these trial balloons like affordable housing. And I'm going to talk about this in the budget where I am a little concerned. And I'm going to talk more about the budgetary process, why a lot of things are trial balloons that may not end up in the final language. But I think administrations have to toe very carefully. We don't want things to swing to either extreme. I think Biden was very misguided in weaponizing public lands to tee up everything to become a national park, to restrict access. The other extreme, in my view, which would hurt conservatives politically, especially those out west, is you go the other extreme where you want to privatize or transfer, give off the appearance of privatizing every acre parcel of federal lands to then be sold to the states, to then open the door so you have private equity firms and others buying up federal lands. And that doesn't negate my support of or run in conflict with my support of private lands. Like, I'm a private property rights advocate. I fully believe in that. But in the United States, we have this unique system in place where the public lands are open to the public, and they should be opened and maintained for us to enjoy, to recreate. And for many people out west, it's to make a livelihood. People graze, they ranch, they have outfitting businesses, they do logging, timber, mining, oil and gas exploration, geothermal, nuclear. So many different things occur on public lands, and you can have both balanced very adequately without despoiling the environment. But I worry that the abundance narrative, it's not abundance itself, but if you are seen as going too much into developing federal lands, it's also going to be challenged in court. And you need Congress to approve the transference and sale of lands, and you don't have a majority to do that if we're playing devil's advocate. It's not something I support professionally or even privately as I'm communicating here. I think you just have to go kind of in the middle ground where you have these agencies restore balance. So I want to see more hunting and fishing openings. That's what the Interior Department is tasked with doing, while also shoring up more mineral leases, oil and gas leases. But if they deviate into this narrative, which I'm going to talk about in the budget, of like selling public lands to recoup for the debt and deficit, even though the deferred maintenance backlog is very different from debt and deficit, and the debt is about $36 trillion, and you're approximating public lands to be $1 to $2 trillion. It's, even if you were to sell that, which would be very misguided to do, it's not even a dent on the debt and deficit. And it's obfuscating and kicking the can down the road for what actually needs to be tackled, which is entitlement spending. Very different from our conversation. But I think a lot of people are scapegoating public lands because it's very sexy to do it on social media. You can get clicks and likes, but there are a lot of ramifications to that. Like I said, I want to see more public land openings. I want to see land better maintained. Where appropriate, I want to see energy projects which are not in conflict with wildlife conservation efforts. We did not see that with this catalyzation of solar and wind. I would be curious to see if we'll have more geothermal plants, natural gas plants, nuclear plants opened on federal lands, and there is a discussion about potentially siting more AI data centers in Department of Energy lands that border, I think, Bureau of Land Management or close to city centers. So I think you could do things practically and smartly, but I am against the wholesale transfer of public lands and affordable housing on public lands. I just think it's too divisive. They are kind of like minority positions, and they're going to be challenged, and constitutionally it may not be, might not be able to do it. And that would undermine, in my opinion, Antiquities Act reforms that we really sorely need if you go in one other extreme. So let's have some balanced use. Like, that's what true conservation is all about. Which leads me into my point about the budget, where I like a lot of the cuts that are being proposed. And I think I am largely in agreement with what I've been preening and reading from the president's proposed fiscal 2026 budget. But I want to tee up this conversation about the budget. I'm not going to give you all the boring details, but a summary of what budget talks are about. So the president has to prepare a budget annually. That's his duty. And Congress right now is doing reconciliation. And the president's budget is part of discretionary spending. So there's mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and interest on the debt. So mandatory spending doesn't really have anything to do with public lands, energy, and the like. It's more so for Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, and other spending required by law. And it's typically over half of all funding. Discretionary spending is federal agency funding. So this is where it comes into with Department of Energy, Department of Interior, and EPA. Congress sets funding levels for each year. It usually accounts for a third of all funding. And then there's interest on the debt, which is less than 10% of all funding. And this is from the federal government, the budgetary process. And a president may propose a budget. It doesn't have to be agreed to, all of its provisions and facets. It usually never is. If you have a cooperative House and Senate, perhaps you can get a lot of those things passed and enacted through the reconciliation process and whatnot. But just because the language of what is being proposed in the budget is out there doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be passed by Congress, because each has a constitutional duty and it's very different. The functions of the executive branch are different than the legislative branch, and we might see a totally different outcome, which is why I'm prefacing this conversation with what you need to know about the budget process, that even if something is included in this preliminary language about fiscal year 2026, some cuts or some increases, that might not be the final language, which is why I want to discuss what I've seen so far that I like. So there is a fact sheet on the president's budget website on the whitehouse.gov. And what I like about his 2026 fiscal year budget is it eliminates funding for what he calls the Green New Scammer, the holdover green policies from the Biden-Harris administration. So he wants to tackle infrastructure investment and Jobs Act Green New Deal funding. So he says the budget will cancel $53 billion in Green New Deal funds for lots of different things. They're going to be tackling the Global Environment Facility Climate Investment Fund, and eliminates contributions to this for functions and entities that fund Green New Deal policies abroad to the detriment of American taxpayers and recipient nations. So they're going to also tackle, this is great because this makes no sense, it doesn't help with environmental justice. Environmental Protection Agency environmental justice grants, it's going to save, if it's passed and enacted, $100 million a year. Eliminating EJ programs that enabled a witch hunt against private industry. EJ programs, as I've talked about before, go to overhead, frivolous spending, and they don't help adversely affected communities that might be affected by legacy pollution and Superfund sites and other threats posed by the environment. EPA research grants to NGOs, NOAA grants and research, policy experience in climate equity and health fellowship, adaptations, webinars. It's like DEI, ESG stuff there. And if you want to read more of these individual programs, they're included in the show notes. Department of Energy, energy efficiency and renewable energy. The budget cuts $2.5 billion to the DOE EERE program, which funneled billions of taxpayer dollars into unreliable energy and EVs to advance Green New Deal agenda. It's responsible for outlandish regulations that drive up the cost for American families, like banning gas stoves and incandescent light bulbs. That's a very popular measure. I see that being included in final language. There's ARPA-E. This is kind of an obscure program. to refocus its research to technologies that produce reliable energy, domestic power, eliminating funding for technologies favored by globalist climate agenda, renewable energy programs at Department of Interior, save taxpayers $80 million by eliminating DOI, renewable energy programs facilitate unreliable energy to the detriment of American consumers, businesses, communities. This includes eliminating funding that supports disastrous offshore wind programs that harm coastal communities, wildlife, military readiness, that I like, BLM conservation programs to proliferate climate alarmism. NGO beneficiaries of this program, like National Environmental Education Foundation, got taxpayer dollars to indoctrinate children focused on climate emotions. That's absurd. I never even heard of that, but I don't see that being a problem to eliminate. Rather, the budget would eliminate these wasteful programs to disempower the climate agenda and prevent further misuse of taxpayer money. In more of the breakdown in terms of his fiscal year 2026 discretionary budget request, let's go into detail with respect to the, let's say, DOE, DOI, and EPA. There's some stuff in agriculture, which has to deal with climate. So Trump wants to get rid of Natural Resource Conservation Service, private lands, conservation operations. He wants to nix $754 million from that, claiming that they help producers deploy conservation on practices. Many have been forced to participate in a program to comply with state environmental regulations, like California's Irrigated Lands Program. And there's a couple others, but let's specifically go to some Department of Energy ones here. Actually, let's start with some of the interior ones, some of the more controversial. Department of Interior cuts, reductions, and consolidations. This is where I'm a little concerned, and I don't think this will end up in the final budget language. Last I checked, and according to the most recent available data, the National Park Service had a budget of about $4 billion from the last administration, and that is very different from deferred maintenance backlog in terms of budgeting and that. And President Biden had ballooned the National Park Service backlog to $23 billion, up from $14 billion that he got from President Trump. So that was about a $8 billion increase in deferred maintenance backlog. The Biden administration couldn't handle that. Where I see a problem with this proposal, I'm going to talk about this now in the budget, where I don't think this makes the final language. Of course, some lefty environmentalists have been screaming about this, and it's not because I agree with them. I have a very different viewpoint of the National Park Service. I think they should be open and not weaponized. They want to restrict National Park Service lands to people who think like them. I think national parks should be open to everyone. And I think National Park Service property, sometimes there's overlap with BLM land and sometimes forest land, which allow for multiple uses. They don't like that. I support multiple uses, even on those shared properties. But national parks are perhaps the most restrictive. Actually, no, wilderness is the most restrictive there. But the budget, there's a difference between deferred backlog and the budget itself and debt and deficit. But where I have an issue potentially with this in particular is the operation of the national park system. So the president is proposing $900 million in cuts. And his justification is the National Park Service responsibilities include a large number of sites that are not national parks in a traditionally understood sense. So there are nearly 430 NPS properties. There's only 63 official national parks. For context, this is my insertion of commentary. In the traditionally understood sense, many of which receive small numbers of mostly local visitors and are better categorized and managed as state-level parks. The budget would continue supporting many national treasures, but there is an urgent need to streamline staffing and transfer certain properties to state-level management to ensure the long-term health and sustainment of the national park system. Now, my understanding of federal land transfers and what the law says, you need Congress to do this. You can't just willy-nilly whip of a pen, say, okay, this transference happens. This happens in the opposite direction, where President Biden unilaterally declares multiple use land on BLM, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service lands to be indemnified, should be protected. It's threatened. Therefore, it should be a national monument to then be prepared to become a national park. So I see both extremes here and a problem. Do states have the capacity to take this up? How is this transference going to occur? Is this the foreshadowing of the selling of public lands? What is the thinking here? And so National Park Service has 430 properties. A lot of people visit that. And according to the National Park Service Green Book, I believe it was from last year, that there were close to 400,000 jobs supported, a $18 billion in labor income, $30 billion economic value added, and about $50 billion in total economic output. Would such a transference, if it were finalized by Congress, put a dent to this? Would it affect jobs, supporting communities? Would it restrict access? What does this management look like? Are states capable right now to do this? I'm not so sure. And it's not because states are terrible managers. It's because nobody has really tackled the National Park Service. We have this problem with maintenance backlog, deferred maintenance backlog. Firing a lot of people doesn't necessarily help either. Are they going to be staffing people to do this? And then at the state level, is the state going to be hiring people to oversee National Park Service lands if those are transferred back? So my understanding is it takes an act of Congress to redraw and reassign public lands from the federal government to the states. I don't see that happening. For those of you who are very skeptical of this, like I am, there's no way in heck that Congress is going to pass this or any semblance of a transference of land. You already have on record several of the Montana delegation members, Senator Daines and former Interior Secretary and return Congressman Ryan Zinke, saying that they do not support any wholesale transfer or selling of public lands. And I think that includes this. There was a preliminary vote, and it failed, sadly, to block the transference of public lands that would end up in a potential reconciliation bill or budget. But again, I don't think this ends up in the final budget process. And even Republicans will have pushback to this. So I have a question, like, who is going to manage this? It takes an act of Congress to transfer public lands from federal to the states. Does this then open it up to businesses? Like, what does this look like? Is there a contingent plan? Are states ready to adopt this because states have their own problems? Are they accounting for this? But in a lot of these Western states, yes, the states are heavily involved. There is a BLM rep in the individual states. Could it hypothetically work if they have things put together? Maybe. But again, like mechanically speaking, I just don't see how this ends up in the final language. It's not going to pass. It's a trial balloon. If I'm wrong, like, I will admit that I'm wrong, but I don't support this, but I also don't think it's going to end up in the final language. And you could read more into the whole process of this. But this will definitely be opposed by a lot of people, including Republicans. And I just don't see this as a practical thing. I think this would take away from the actual cutting. And we have seen with Doge, which was started in principle in a good way. They have admitted that if they overcut and over trim, that they would try to rectify the problem. And the National Park System and Service is one of the few agencies that actually enjoys popularity. And there were some problems from Biden-Harris that needed to be corrected. They were inserting a lot of ESG, CRT, DEI jargon and posturing into the agency where it shouldn't have belonged. But is this an overcorrection? That could be an argument that I see as plausible. But like I said, if you want to review all the provisions of the president's fiscal requests and all that, I've included it in the show notes. But I am a little concerned about this National Park Service provision. That doesn't mean it should be managed a lot better. It absolutely can. But I think there's a different way about going with this rather than defunding it and then transferring it. And again, you need an act of Congress to transfer public. The president cannot sign a pen, sign a signature, and then whoop, it's transferred. It's a lot more difficult than that. And I don't think that'd be a wise and prudent decision for the president to do. It would undermine his balanced use agenda and kind of undermine and undercut that. So, and nobody has really talked about transferring National Park Service properties to the states. Like, could that end up even more being expensive than what it is already? Would that strain the National Park Service further, strain budgets of the states? And my understanding is they would still be in cooperation with the federal government, so you're not entirely removing that. But this takes a lot more than just changes in the budget, like that transference, a lot of sticking points with that, a lot of problems. Do the states have enough adeptness to do this? I'm not sure at this point in time. And if it's perceived to be a transference of land, that's not going to be a good PR move, I think, for the Trump administration, if they're trying to be for true conservation. Just promise more deferred maintenance backlog management, restoring the parks, restoring the infrastructure. That I think is a wise use of money in the budget rather than just defunding it altogether. And maybe not, it's not an entire defunding because the budget, they say, was almost $4 billion, but this is a good chunk of that, and we have to see what that is. But again, I think this is largely a trial balloon. You have to understand that in the budget process, not everything proposed is going to make it into the final version because you have Congress, which has its own responsibilities with discretionary spending, and it may not mean the president gets every single thing he wants. This is a lofty presentation. This is the same for Democrats. Like, they didn't get everything they want with the budget, and this doesn't necessarily mean President Trump will get everything with the budget. So I do like a lot of the cuts to the green spending and the superfluous ESG, CRT, DEI programs. And I think that if you codify a lot of the DOGE stuff, that is going to be great and it's going to be helping us. But what also could be a problem in addition to this provision for National Park Service, if you're only having what I see now, $400 million in cuts from the IRA instead of $850 million, that a lot, or $850 billion, rather than a lot of us would like to see. From these cuts, $400 billion, half of the proposed $850 billion that some are floating around the tax foundation and others. It's really not going to help with the debt and deficit. And there's other areas where the president wants to increase spending. So is it really going to have an impact? Is it really going to lead to a lessening of the debt and deficit? That remains to be seen. But they have to be very careful. And anything that is seen as an attack on national parks and public lands doesn't really fly over well. So the president has to proceed very carefully here, I think. And Congress may not greenlight this provision. So it's a wait and see game. If this ends up in the final budget, I might make some noise about it privately. But I think this is just a trial balloon, like a lot of this stuff floating around. Because again, with the narrow majorities in Congress, the general love and admiration for the national parks, and everyone believes that there can be some improvements. Does this take it a step too far? That's what a lot of people have to have in their minds. There will be Republican opposition to this as well. And speaking of the National Park Service, we're going to end on an interesting note. The president likes to float trial balloons. We hear about this talk of invading Greenland for critical minerals. We do have to have more of a play in the Arctic. I do agree with that. But invading a country that is closely aligned with Denmark is probably not the best solution. And I think, sadly, the window of opportunity to buy Greenland died when we didn't proceed with it right after our purchase of Alaska from the Russians. It's very expensive now to wholesale purchase it. I think $3 trillion. That's going to add to our debt and deficit. But we see this proposal to reopen Alcatraz prison, which is protected and overseen by the National Park Service. There is a tie-in here, and it's not just me trying to get clicks. Alcatraz, historic site now, the former penitentiary in San Francisco Bay, is overseen. It's one of the 430 properties overseen by the National Park Service. If I go to the NPS website, which I'm going to do for you all right now, as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, it's one of 430 national park units overseen by the National Park Service. And you can purchase tickets to visit it, and you can only access it by boat, from my understanding. But what is the history of this recreation area? It was established by Congress in 1972. Golden Gate offers a national park experience to a diverse urban population. Alcatraz, if you don't know, gets 1.2 million visitors a year. It's an opportunity for visitors to explore the U.S. Army and military prison period through the federal penitentiary era. And then we jailed American Indians here. Alcatraz Island provides a powerful opportunity to encourage visitors to contemplate their personal views on crime and punishment, the judicial system, national defense, and freedom. And here are some problems, unfortunately, that the president will run into with his grand idea to make Alcatraz great again. It's the historic Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, and he says that he wants to reopen it to house hardened criminals, which I don't disagree with in principle. Could there be another area in the country, high security maximum prisons, where he could put people? Absolutely. This place, I'm not so sure. Alcatraz closed 60 years ago because it was too expensive to operate. According to news reports in the Bureau of Prisons, it was 3 times more expensive to operate than other federal facilities. Reading from Newsweek, here's a little context. The prison was required an estimated $3 to $5 million in restoration and maintenance work just to remain operational. Due to escalating costs, the federal government decided it was more economical to close Alcatraz and build a new institution elsewhere. It closed on March 21st, 1963. There were 14 escapes from Alcatraz, so that kind of defeats the argument that it's impenetrable. Don't we want prisons that people can't escape from, even with its interesting location in San Francisco Bay? Will the prison still be open to visitors so they could learn about the history, or does it become a fully functional penitentiary system again? What's going to be the cost to refurbish it, to make it suitable to house prisoners? Are there other areas of the country that could do this similarly without the overhead and the expenses? That's to be made, an argument to be made. But does this factor into that budget proposal of cutting $900 million from the National Park Service? Is this part of the plan? That I can't definitively say, but maybe it has some sort of relation to it. Will this be Alcatraz again 2.0, fully functional during the Trump administration? This could be proposed now. Does it become fully functional during Trump's second term, or does it get canceled when a new president takes over? Let's say a Democrat takes over in 3 years. Does this get canceled and doesn't come to fruition? That also can be plausible too. We will certainly see the debate over this happen because it's a very catchy news story. People love talking about these random stories that come about. It makes for a great fodder. I'm not sure how practical this is. And does this take away from the historical nature of the prison? Like, shouldn't we want people to visit it? Like, is it going to be more profitable to house prisoners again, or to have people visit the 1.2 million who visit? So that remains to be seen. I'm not knocking the president. I largely support a lot of his policies, but I think this could be a distraction from his goal to make public lands more accessible to people, promoting energy dominance. Like, why is this a priority right now? Like, can't you house prisoners, hardened criminals in other prisons, which are already built, and not use more taxpayer money? I think that's more practical. We want to be fiscally conservative, right? That's my thinking into this. So I'm not sure how I feel about Alcatraz reopening. Like, it's funny, great, haha. But is it fiscally practical? Do you get anything out of it? Like, what's it going to accomplish? Like, are people going to escape? Because it has a history of people fleeing it too. So that also is something to consider with Alcatraz potentially being reopened. What say you? If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.